The Force had never felt like this before. Obi-Wan Kenobi had stood in the heart of battle on 100 worlds. He had felt the Force ripple through burning Christophsis, whisper through the fog of Kamino, and scream across the lava fields of Mustafar. He knew the Force the way a musician knows silence, not as an absence, but as a presence so fundamental that its disruption was physically nauseating. This was a disruption. One moment he had been meditating in his small refuge on Tatooine, reaching carefully into the living Force as he often did in those hollow desert years, searching for nothing in particular and finding, as usual, the quiet hum of sand, beetles, and the distant emotional signature of a boy sleeping in a moisture farmer's home. Then something had pulled, not gently, not the way the Force sometimes tugged at the edges of his consciousness when it wanted his attention. This was a tearing, a seam in reality opening without warning or apology. And Obi-Wan Kenobi, former general of the Grand Army of the Republic, fell through it like a stone through water. He landed on concrete. That was his first observation. Not sand, not durasteel, concrete, rough, gray, faintly damp from recent rain, and around him, a city that bore no resemblance to anything in his considerable galactic experience. The buildings were tall, but not Coruscant tall, crammed together without the towering elegance of Republic architecture. Ground-level streets were actually visible from where he knelt, which meant no lower levels. No underworld swallowing itself in perpetual shadow. The sky was blue, a single sun. The air smelled of something fried and sweet from a nearby vendor stall. And underneath that, the acrid bite of, he turned his head, smoke. Not far. 2 streets over, perhaps 3. Obi-Wan rose to his feet with the unhurried economy of a man who had been waking up in dangerous situations for 30 years. He took stock. Robe, present. Lightsaber, clipped to his belt. And he could feel the Kyber crystal's familiar resonance through the hilt. The Force, present, but strange, muffled in some places, oddly amplified in others, as if the energy field that governed this world was having a polite argument with the midi-chlorians in his blood about who had jurisdiction. He would worry about that later. The smoke was getting thicker. He moved toward it because that was, in his experience, the direction one moved when one was the only person available to help. The streets were not empty. People were running, which told him they were running from something. And he pressed against their current like a stone in a stream, calm and deliberate, taking in everything. The people here were extraordinary. That was not a casual observation. In 30-plus years of galactic service, Obi-Wan had seen species with 4 arms, species with no eyes, species that communicated entirely through bioluminescent skin. He was not easily surprised by biological variation. But these people, these apparently human people, were extraordinary in ways that seemed deeply personal. A woman sprinting past him had hair that moved on its own, coiling around her shoulders in agitation. A child being carried by his father had fingers that glowed faintly, orange at the tips. A man in a business suit was running approximately 8 centimeters above the pavement without appearing to notice he was doing it. Obi-Wan filed all of this away and kept walking. The source of the smoke revealed itself at the intersection of 2 main streets. A man approximately 3 meters tall, not species tall. Wrong tall, proportion wrong. Like something that had decided the rules of human anatomy were merely suggestions, was tearing through the front of a building with hands that crackled with some kind of kinetic energy. The building was a bank. Civilians were screaming behind overturned vehicles and standing between the enormous man and the fleeing crowd was a single figure in a black bodysuit with a masked helmet, holding the ground with visible effort against shockwaves that cracked the pavement in rings. A protector, outmatched. Obi-Wan assessed the tactical situation in approximately 1.3 seconds. The giant's attack pattern was straightforward, emotionally driven, not tactically considered. The protector was buying time, not engaging. Civilians were mostly clear to the east, but a small cluster of 4 remained pinned behind a structural pillar the giant was about to reduce to rubble. And then he walked into the intersection. "Excuse me," he said. The giant stopped. The protector's helmet turned toward him. The watching civilians went briefly silent in the way people do when they cannot believe what they are witnessing. "I realize this may be an awkward moment for an introduction," Obi-Wan continued. in a tone one might use to discuss the weather. But I wonder if we might talk about this. The giant stared at him. Then it swung. Obi-Wan stepped to the left, not dramatically, not with any flourish, simply stepped. The way Sarisu had trained him to treat every attack as an opportunity, to not be where the attack was going. And the fist cratered the pavement where he had been standing. Before the giant could recalibrate, Obi-Wan's lightsaber was in his hand. The blue blade ignited with its familiar snap hiss, and for just a moment, everyone in the intersection, villain, hero, huddled civilians, went completely still. He used that stillness. He reached through the strange, interfering energy of this world and found just enough of the force to give the four-pinned civilians a firm telekinetic push toward the Eastern Alliance safety. Now then, Obi-Wan said, lightsaber humming, beard catching the reflected blue light. I am Obi-Wan Kenobi. I have no quarrel with you. I have never had a quarrel with anyone that could not, in principle, be resolved without property damage. But if you insist, the giant swung again. We can do it this way. If you want to see more characters cross over into unexpected worlds, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd love to see in the comments below. May the force be with you. The giant hit the pavement face first with a sound like a small building collapsing. It had taken Obi-Wan 47 seconds. He had not struck the villain once. That was worth noting. Not out of pride. Pride was something he had largely made peace with over years of desert solitude, but because it was relevant tactical information about his own capabilities in this strange, force-dampened world. Sarisu, the third form of lightsaber combat, the form of the immovable object, had not been designed for offense. It had been designed for this, for making an opponent exhaust themselves against a defense so complete, so economical, so utterly without wasted motion, that they eventually created their own defeat. The giant had swung 14 times. Each swing had meant nothing but air and the quiet repositioning of a man who had spent decades learning that the best place to be during an attack was somewhere else. On the final swing, overextended and furious, the giant had stumbled. Obi-Wan had guided, not thrown, guided the momentum with a subtle force assist that cost him considerably more effort than it should have. And 300 kilograms of villain had introduced itself to the concrete. He deactivated his lightsaber as the black-suited protector approached. Up close, the helmet had a speaker grill and lenses that were probably recording everything. Obi-Wan found this mildly concerning. He had experience with surveillance states, but kept his expression pleasantly neutral, which was an expression he had been perfecting since his Padawan years. What? The protector said, and then appeared to run out of words. Kenobi, Obi-Wan offered helpfully. Obi-Wan Kenobi, I apologize for inserting myself into what was clearly your situation. I hope I haven't disrupted any established protocol. The helmet tilted. Your quirk. What is it? The word meant nothing to him. He could feel, through the force, or whatever approximation of the force was available to him here, that the question was sincere, that the person inside the suit was young, perhaps mid-20s, genuinely bewildered and not immediately hostile. A protector then, not an enforcer. There was a difference. And in his experience, it was the most important difference in any armed organization. I'm not certain I have one, Obi-Wan said honestly. I'm not certain I know what one is. 3 more figures arrived within the next 2 minutes, which told him the response. Infrastructure of this city was organized and moderately efficient. One was a woman with enormous engines mounted on her calves who descended from above with a sound, like a small starfighter. One was a man whose skin had turned to what appeared to be solid stone. The third was moving so quickly that Obi-Wan's eye could barely track the displacement of air, and was suddenly simply present where he had not been a moment before. All 3 stopped when they saw the downed giant. Then they saw Obi-Wan. He did it, the black-suited protector said, in a tone that suggested this information was difficult to process. Alone, in under a minute, the stone-skinned man looked at the crater where the giant's fist had landed, then at Obi-Wan, then at the crater again. What's his quirk? He says he doesn't know what a quirk is. A silence fell over the group, that Obi-Wan recognized as the specific silence of people recalibrating their assumptions about a situation. He had caused this silence many times, usually in Senate hearings, occasionally in separatist command rooms. Once, memorably, during a diplomatic dinner on Mandalore. But that was a story for another time. I think, he said carefully, that I may be rather far from home. I wonder if someone might be able to help me understand where exactly I am and what is happening here. I have questions. I suspect you have more. They took him to a building that functioned as a local hero agency. He gathered this word. Hero carried specific institutional weight here. Not merely descriptive, but almost a professional designation. And for the next 2 hours, Obi-Wan Kenobi sat across a table from 4 professional heroes and engaged in what he privately categorized as one of the more unusual debriefs of his career. He learned this world was called Earth. The country was Japan. The city was Mizudafu. Approximately 80% of the population had developed superhuman abilities in the last several generations. These were called quirks. The remaining 20% were called quirkless. And the social weight of that term told him considerable things about how this society organized its hierarchies. There existed a professional class of licensed warriors called heroes who were authorized by the government to combat threats and maintain public order. There were rankings. There were cameras. There were sponsorships, which he found baffling in the specific way that a former Jedi general finds the commodification of public safety baffling. He gave them, in return, a version of the truth, stripped of details he was not yet willing to share with strangers. He was a traveler. He had arrived unexpectedly. The weapon at his belt was from his place of origin. He was not a threat. He did not mention the Force by name because he did not yet know whether the concept would translate. And one of the first lessons of diplomacy was that you did not introduce terminology you could not control the interpretation of. No quirk registry entry, the stone-skinned man said, reading from a device that functioned something like a datapad. No identification. No record anywhere. No, Obi-Wan agreed. You took down a B-rank villain in 47 seconds without taking a single hit. I've had practice. The woman with the engines. She had introduced herself as Burnin, which he suspected was a professional name rather than a given one, leaned forward. Someone's going to want to talk to you. Someone above our pay grade. Obi-Wan folded his hands on the table with the patience of a man who had once spent 6 hours in a separatist holding cell composing haiku. I expected as much, he said. I'm quite good at talking. The school sat on a hill like it was daring the rest of the city to have opinions about it. Obi-Wan had been in institutions of learning before. The Jedi Temple on Coruscant had been vast and ancient, its spires reaching toward a sky perpetually obscured by traffic and smog, its halls carrying the accumulated weight of 10,000 years of philosophical tradition. There had been something cathedral about it, the way sound moved differently in those corridors, the way younglings learned instinctively to speak more softly, the way every room felt as though it remembered everyone who had ever stood in it. UA Academy was not like that. It was large, modern, and aggressively deliberate in its architecture, the kind of building that had been designed by someone who wanted it to communicate seriousness and was perhaps trying slightly too hard. The grounds were immaculate. The security was sophisticated, and as Obi-Wan was escorted through its main gates by a representative from the Hero Public Safety Commission, a precise woman named Takahashi, who had the energy of someone who had written 17 memos this morning and was annoyed that the 18th memo had arrived in the form of an unregistered interdimensional traveler. He could feel through the strange, filtered force of this world the concentrated presence of something remarkable. Young people, dozens of them, burning with potential. He recognized that particular quality. He had felt it once in every Padawan he had ever encountered. That specific combination of power not yet mastered, ambition not yet tempered, and courage that hadn't yet learned what it was afraid of. It was one of the most beautiful and most dangerous combinations in any sentient being, and this school was apparently full of it. Principal Nizu received him in an office that managed to be simultaneously welcoming and subtly intimidating, a skill Obi-Wan genuinely respected, and the small white creature behind the desk regarded him with eyes of extraordinary intelligence. Master Kenobi, Nizu said, folding his paws together. What a genuinely unprecedented morning you've given us. I do try to make an impression, Obi-Wan said. Please sit. Nizu gestured to a chair that was slightly lower than his own desk. which was another thing Obi-Wan noticed and respected. I've reviewed the incident report from Mizudafu's 4th District. I've also reviewed the results from every scan our medical facility attempted to run on you this morning, which were, collectively, the most confusing medical data this institution has ever produced. I can imagine. Your cellular structure contains something our instruments cannot classify. Your brain activity during moments of, let's call it focus, produces readings that our neurologists have described. And I am quoting directly, as theoretically impossible. You carry a weapon that does not match any registered quark-generated ability or known technology on this planet. Nizu tilted his head with the precise, bird-like quality of someone who found genuine puzzles genuinely delightful. And yet you sit in front of me, radiating what I can only describe as profound reasonableness, which is either very reassuring or very concerning. And I find I cannot yet determine which. In my experience, Obi-Wan said, those two things are often the same. Nizu was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. A small, genuine thing. I would like to propose something unusual, Master Kenobi. Our research teams will need time to understand your biology and determine whether your abilities constitute a public safety concern. During that time, you need somewhere to stay, a context within which to understand our world, and, I suspect, something useful to do with your hands. I am therefore proposing that you spend some time observing our hero course. Obi-Wan considered this. In Jedi terms, it was a straightforward offer. Shelter in exchange for cooperation and supervised visibility. The political logic was sound. He would be watched, but openly so, which was preferable to whatever the alternative might look like. I would be glad to observe, he said. He met Shota Aizawa outside Class 1A's door. The man looked like he had not slept since the previous geological era, which Obi-Wan found oddly comforting. It was a look he recognized from clone commanders on extended deployment. Aizawa looked at him with the flat, assessing gaze of someone who had developed a professional allergy to surprises and was currently experiencing an allergic reaction. You're the one from the 4th District, Aizawa said. Guilty. You have no quirk registration. Also guilty. You're going to sit in the back of my classroom and observe. Those are my instructions, yes. Aizawa stared at him for 3 more seconds. Don't speak unless I invite you to. Don't touch anything. Don't. He looked at the lightsaber on Obi-Wan's belt. Ignite that in an enclosed space. Perfectly reasonable. The class was extraordinary. That was the word. That kept returning to him as he sat quietly at the rear of the room and watched 20 young people engage in a combat assessment exercise. They were 15 or 16 years old, and they moved with the confidence of people who had been told their entire lives that they were exceptional, which they were, genuinely, in terms of raw ability. But beneath that confidence, Obi-Wan could see, with the particular clarity that decades of reading people provided, something that troubled him. They were performing, not fighting, not training, performing, for each other, for an implicit audience of rankings and recognition that seemed to hover over every exchange. Like an invisible judge, a boy with explosive sweat on his palms hit harder than necessary because the boy across from him was watching. A girl with a creation, quirk held back in ways that had nothing to do with control and everything to do with not wanting to seem like she was showing off. A young man with ice and fire capabilities was having an argument with himself that had nothing to do with the exercise at hand. Obi-Wan watched all of this and thought of Anakin. He thought of Anakin quite often, in the quiet moments, in the moments that looked like other things. After the exercise concluded, Aizawa dismissed the class to cool down, and one student, a boy with green hair and an earnest face that practically radiated the specific quality of someone who had spent years being told they weren't enough and had decided to become more anyway, approached the back of the room with the careful confidence of someone screwing up courage. Excuse me, the boy said. I'm Izuku Midoriya. Your fighting style earlier in the 4th District. I saw the footage, the way you moved. It wasn't like any quirk I've ever analyzed, and I was wondering. You watch footage of hero incidents for analysis, Obi-Wan said. Midoriya blinked. Yes. And you carry a notebook. The boy looked down at the worn notebook in his hands as if he'd forgotten it was there. Yes. Obi-Wan regarded him with the quiet attention he had once reserved for particularly promising initiates. "What did you notice?" he said. "About the way I moved." Midoriya's eyes lit up like someone had opened a blast door. Midoriya talked for 4 minutes without stopping. Obi-Wan listened to all of it. This was not a passive activity. Listening, genuine listening. The kind that tracked not just words, but the architecture beneath them. The assumptions built into sentence structure. The things left unsaid because the speaker considered them too obvious to mention was a skill Obi-Wan had spent decades refining. It had served him better than his lightsaber on more occasions than he could count. Kagan had taught him that. The Force speaks most clearly through other people, his master had said once. On a transport somewhere between Coruscant and a planet, Obi-Wan could no longer remember. If you can learn to be quiet enough to hear it. So he listened, and what he heard beneath Midoriya's breathless tactical breakdown, the boy had correctly identified. His lateral footwork pattern had noted the precise angle of his weight distribution during the giant's fourth swing, had somehow calculated from a grainy street recording the approximate reach differential he had been accounting for was this: a young person who loved understanding things for its own sake, not for what that understanding could win him. The notebook was not a performance. The analysis was genuine hunger. "You fight like you're not trying to win," Midoriya said, finally pausing. Then immediately, "Sorry, that came out wrong. I didn't mean." "No," Obi-Wan said. "You're quite right." Midoriya stopped. "I was trained in a defensive form," Obi-Wan continued. "The philosophy behind it is that victory achieved through an opponent's overextension is more complete than victory achieved through superior offense. You do not beat them. You allow them to defeat themselves." He paused. "It also tends to result in fewer casualties on both sides, which I have always found preferable." The boy stared at him with an expression Obi-Wan recognized as the specific look of someone encountering an idea that reorganizes several other ideas they already had. He had seen it on Anakin's face, occasionally, more often on Ahsoka's. He felt something move in the filtered, dampened force of this world, not a vision, not the clear precognition he was accustomed to, more like a suggestion, and looked at Midoriya with slightly more attention. There was something in this boy, not the Force. He was reasonably certain the Force as he understood it did not exist here in the same form, but something analogous, something that had been given or inherited or chosen, something that carried weight. He did not mention this. He filed it carefully. Aizawa reappeared at the classroom door and aimed a look at Midoriya that communicated an entire conversation in under a second, the specific language of a teacher who has had to communicate with this particular student non-verbally many times before. Midoriya said a hasty goodbye and retreated. Obi-Wan rose and followed Aizawa into the corridor. "He's thorough," Obi-Wan said. "He's a problem," Aizawa said, in the tone of someone who finds a particular problem deeply worthwhile. "What did you make of the class?" Obi-Wan considered his answer with the care he applied to all diplomatic responses. Not dishonesty, never dishonesty, but precision about which truth to lead with. "They're talented," he said. "But," "I didn't say but." "You had a but face." Obi-Wan decided he liked Aizawa. "They are performing," he said, "for each other, for whatever ranking system this institution uses to evaluate them. Some of them are making tactical decisions based not on what is most effective, but on what will be most visible." He paused. "That is a habit that gets people killed." Aizawa was quiet for a moment. They walked. The corridor smelled of cleaning, solution, and faintly of something that had been burned, which Obi-Wan suspected was an occupational constant in a school full of students with combustion-based abilities. "The hero billboard rankings are published nationally," Aizawa said finally. "Every agency's income depends on popularity metrics as much as incident resolution. Students grow up watching heroes who are famous partly for being watchable. The system selects for visibility." He glanced sideways at Obi-Wan. "I've been complaining about it for years. Administration finds me exhausting." "I find you refreshingly direct," Obi-Wan said. They stopped at a window overlooking a training ground where another class was running a different exercise, something involving capture flags and students whose quirks produced impressive visual effects. Watching from the far side of the ground, motionless as a statue, was a figure Obi-Wan had not yet seen up close but whose presence he had noticed the moment he entered the building, because it was impossible not to notice, even through the interference that muffled his force sensitivity in this world. That figure radiated something immense and deliberate, a vast power being maintained at careful, constant restraint. Who was that? Obi-Wan asked. Toshinori Yagi, Aizawa said. He teaches here. You may know him by another name. The figure turned slightly, as if sensing observation. And even at this distance, Obi-Wan could see the gaunt architecture of a body that had once been something much larger. A man who had spent himself down to the frame. He recognized that quality too. He saw it every morning in the mirror he kept in his Tatooine hut. The reflection of someone who had survived something that should have taken him and was still working out what to do with the fact of that survival. I would like to meet him, Obi-Wan said quietly. Later, Aizawa said. Nizu wants you in the faculty meeting first. There's a situation developing. There was always a situation developing. In Obi-Wan's experience, this was one of the fundamental constants of the universe, applicable across galaxies apparently. Of course, he said. Lead the way. The faculty meeting was held in a conference room that contained, among others, a man whose quirk appeared to be that he was entirely made of muscle in a way that exceeded anatomical convention. A woman whose hair moved with aggressive emotional responsiveness. A man with an enormous naval cannon where his navel should have been. Obi-Wan absorbed this without visible reaction, which was itself a kind of reaction, and Nizu, presiding with the cheerful authority of someone who understood every person in the room better than they understood themselves. The situation, it emerged, was this. Someone was asking questions about him. Not the Hero Public Safety Commission, who were asking questions through official channels. Someone else. Someone operating through proxies and information brokers, requesting specifically his power profile, his location, and the nature of his weapon. Obi-Wan listened to this information and felt something in the strange force of this world shift in a way. That was not quite a warning but was certainly not an invitation to relax. How interesting, he said. The information broker's name was Jiren, and he had the energy of a man who had made peace with his own moral flexibility a long time ago and found the arrangement quite comfortable. Obi-Wan did not meet him directly. He didn't need to. Through careful conversation with Aizawa, who had, it emerged an extensive and professionally complicated knowledge of the underworld networks that operated beneath the hero systems. Visibility. He was able to construct a reasonably complete picture of who was asking about him and through what channels. The request had originated 3 days after his arrival, which meant someone had been watching the 4th District footage very carefully and very quickly. The request had asked specifically about the energy signature of his lightsaber, the nature of abilities that produced no quirk factor readings in standard scans, and his current location. The request had come from the League of Villains. Obi-Wan sat with this information for approximately 30 seconds, which was how long it took him to run through the relevant tactical considerations and arrive at a conclusion that was, in its broad strokes, depressingly familiar. There was always a Dooku. In every conflict, in every political landscape he had ever navigated, there was always someone who had correctly identified the system's flaws and then made the catastrophic decision that the correct response to a flawed system was its violent destruction, rather than its patient reform. The details changed. The trajectory never did. Tell me about them, he said to Aizawa. They were in the teacher's office, a small room that was aggressively utilitarian. Every surface occupied by something functional. No decoration except a single photograph that Obi-Wan did not look at directly, because it was not his business, and Aizawa spoke for 20 minutes with the flat, exhausted precision of someone who had been worrying about this particular threat for longer than was good for his health. The League of Villains, led by Tamura Shigaraki, a young man whose quirk disintegrated anything he touched with all 5 fingers. Obi-Wan noted this carefully, the specific number, and adjusted several assumptions about close quarters engagement, and who operated under the mentorship of a figure called All for One, whose true power and current status were matters of some uncertainty. The League's philosophy, such as it was, centered on the destruction of hero society as a system, not reform, not replacement. Destruction, which Obi-Wan found simultaneously understandable in its diagnosis and deeply troubling in its prescription. Shigaraki is not a strategist, Aizawa said. He's a player. He approaches everything like a game he's losing and responds by trying to flip the board. And whoever is advising him? Obi-Wan asked. All for one. Currently incapacitated. Imprisoned, possibly. Aizawa's expression suggested he found the word possibly professionally distressing. There may be a new advisor. We're not certain. Obi-Wan filed this. An organization with destructive intent, led by a volatile young man, mentored by someone whose influence persisted despite apparent removal from the field. The parallels to certain Sith operational structures were uncomfortable, enough that he chose not to examine them too closely. Some pattern recognition served no purpose except to depress you. He spent the following days in a careful rhythm. Mornings observing Class 1A, afternoons in conversation with Nizu or the faculty, evenings in the small guest quarters the school had provided, a room that was clean, quiet, and reminded him of nothing so much as his hut on Tatooine, which he chose to interpret as cozy rather than sparse. He meditated. The force here was strange, but not absent. And each day the interference felt slightly less like trying to hear someone through a wall and slightly more like trying to hear someone through a very thick door. Progress. He also, quietly and without announcement, began to watch the students. Not in a surveillance sense. He had lived under Palpatine's Republic long enough to have strong opinions about surveillance, but in the way a teacher watches, which is a specific and entirely different activity. He watched Midoriya push himself past sensible limits and then push further, as if he didn't quite believe he had the right to stop. He watched the explosive boy, Bakugo, he'd learned the name, perform constant aggression as a kind of armor over something more complicated underneath. He watched a girl named Uraraka calculate every situation twice, once for effectiveness, and once for whether it would endanger the people she cared about. He watched a boy named Todoroki carry something very heavy and very cold in the left half of his face and was careful not to stare. He thought about what Aizawa had said on that first day. The system selects for visibility. He thought about the Jedi Order, which had selected for detachment, and what that selection had eventually cost. On the fifth day, he was in the corridor outside the gym when he heard it, not with his ears, but with whatever fraction of force sensitivity remained available to him in this world, a spike of distress, quickly suppressed from the direction of the support course workshops. He followed it without thinking, the way a compass needle follows north, and found a girl sitting on the floor of a supply alcove with her knees pulled to her chest, and an expression of someone who had been holding something together through sheer determination and had just run out of determination. He recognized her from the class. Momo Yaoyorozu, creation quirk, exceptional technical intelligence, had been making, he now realized, very small tactical errors in training exercises for the past 3 days, the kind of errors that were invisible unless you were looking for them, and that all pointed in the same direction. She startled when she saw him, immediately straightened, immediately composed her expression into something appropriate. Master Kenobi, I apologize, I was just sitting, he said, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. He considered the alcove, then sat down on the floor himself, back against the wall, with the unceremonious ease of a man who had slept on considerably worse surfaces. He said nothing further. She stared at him. You're sitting on the floor. I am. You're a guest of the principal. I am that too. A long pause. Then, carefully, I've been making mistakes in training. Yes, he said. You noticed. I notice most things. It is, for better or worse, a professional habit. He looked at the middle distance rather than at her, which was a technique he had found over the years was less pressurizing for people who were working up to saying something difficult. Would you like to tell me what's underneath them? The silence that followed was the particular silence of someone deciding whether to trust someone they have no particular reason to trust yet. He waited. He was very good at waiting. I don't know if I'm good enough, she said finally, very quietly. Not whether I work hard enough, or whether I try hard enough. I know I do both of those things. I mean whether I'm good enough, whether what I have is actually enough. She stopped. I know how that sounds. It sounds, Obi-Wan said carefully, like a question I have heard before, from people who turned out to be extraordinary. He paused. And occasionally from people who did not. The question itself is not diagnostic. What matters is what you do while you're waiting for the answer. She was quiet for a moment. What did you do? While you were waiting. He thought of Kagan, of the council, of a desert planet and a boy sleeping in a moisture farmer's home. I kept going, he said. Imperfectly. Stubbornly. With rather more sarcasm than was probably necessary. He rose from the floor. Come. Aizawa will be starting the afternoon session. And I believe you have things to show that class that you have been holding back. She looked up at him. How do you know? Because, he said simply, I was watching. The hostage situation began at 6:14 in the morning on a Tuesday, which Obi-Wan had come to understand was an aggressively ordinary time for an aggressively ordinary day, and was therefore exactly when something extraordinary would happen. He had been awake already. He was always awake before dawn, old habit, desert habit, the kind of routine that calcifies into necessity when you have spent years alone with nothing but sand and guilt and the distant hum of the force for company. He had been meditating in his quarters, working carefully at the interference that still muffled his sensitivity, like cloth over a speaker, making gradual and frustrating progress. When the alert came through the communication device Nizu had provided him, a pharmaceutical warehouse in the Narahata district, 3 armed individuals, 11 employees taken. The heroes dispatched first, a psychic agency team, for people competent by the metrics Obi-Wan had been reading in the incident reports. Aizawa had somewhat reluctantly shared with him, had established a perimeter and installed, because one of the 3 individuals inside had a quirk that produced a localized electromagnetic disruption field, which had disabled 2 heroes' equipment and made the third's quirk, which was apparently electronic in nature, completely inoperable. Nizu had called him. I want to be transparent, the principal had said, his voice carrying the specific warmth of someone being strategic with their warmth. This is partly a test. I want to see how you operate in a real situation, without the adrenaline variable of an unexpected street encounter. I think you deserve to know that. I appreciate the honesty, Obi-Wan had said, already reaching for his robe. I want to be equally transparent. I intend to resolve this without anyone being seriously hurt, including the 3 inside. Is that acceptable to the Hero Public Safety Commission? A pause. That would be the preferred outcome, yes. Then we're aligned. He arrived at the perimeter at 6:31. The electromagnetic disruption field was immediately apparent even before he saw the warehouse. It manifested as a specific kind of pressure in the already strange force landscape of this world, a localized dead zone where the interference that usually muffled his sensitivity became something more aggressive. He noted this, adjusted. The force had been navigating interference since before this individual's grandmother was born. The perimeter commander, a pro-hero called Shield Wall, a broad man whose quirk generated defensive barriers and who had the professionally contained frustration of someone watching a situation deteriorate beyond their toolkit, briefed him quickly and without apparent ego, which Obi-Wan found encouraging. 3 inside, Shield Wall said. Leader has the EM field. Second has some kind of strength. Amplification took out the east wall support column when we tried entry. Third is unconfirmed. We haven't seen the third one move or speak since initial contact. 11 employees, Obi-Wan said. Their condition? Unconfirmed. No injuries reported at time of takeover. That was 40 minutes ago. Communication? They've spoken twice. They want to transport out of the country in a public statement from the Hero Public Safety Commission acknowledging Shield Wall's expression suggested the content of the demand was both specific and complicated, acknowledging that the hero ranking system constitutes economic exploitation of quirk users for private agency profit. Obi-Wan was quiet for a moment. That's not an entirely unreasonable critique, he said. Shield Wall stared at him. Of the system, Obi-Wan clarified. Not of the methodology. The methodology is deeply unreasonable. He looked at the warehouse. May I try something? What he tried was this. He walked to the warehouse's eastern personnel door, knocked 3 times with the unhurried rhythm of someone who has all the time in the galaxy, and said, loudly enough to carry through the door, but quietly enough that it didn't read as escalation. My name is Obi-Wan Kenobi. I don't work for the Hero Public Safety Commission. I'm not ranked, registered, or sponsored. I have no camera crew, no agency affiliation, and no interest in how this looks on a broadcast. I would simply like to talk. Silence. 40 seconds of it. He waited. The door opened 4 centimeters. An eye appeared in the gap. Young. He could tell even from that partial view. Younger than he'd expected, younger than their methodology deserved. You're the one from the 4th District video, a voice said. The one with the lightsaber. I am. You're not a real hero. That depends enormously on how you define the word. Obi-Wan said. May I come in? I should mention that I'm going to leave my weapon outside if I do. As a gesture of good faith. He unclipped his lightsaber and set it on the ground to his left with the deliberate visibility of someone making a choice, rather than following an instruction. I find conversations go better when everyone is equally uncomfortable. The door opened wider. Inside, the warehouse smelled of industrial solvent and the specific anxious sweat of 11 people who had been frightened for 40 minutes. He assessed the room in the way Sarisu trained you to assess every room. Entry points, structural load bearers, lines of sight, relative positioning of every person. The 3 were young. The leader, a young woman with close-cropped hair and the focused tension of someone maintaining a difficult quirk for an extended period, tracked him with eyes that were intelligent and exhausted in equal measure. The strength amplifier was a heavy-set young man sitting on a crate with his arms crossed in an attitude of performed confidence covering genuine uncertainty. The 3rd, a slight figure in the corner who hadn't moved, appeared to be asleep, which Obi-Wan found surprising until he noticed the faint shimmer of what he suspected was a passive quirk operating in standby. The 11 employees were seated along the far wall, zip-tied but physically unharmed. He focused on the leader. Tell me, he said quietly, taking a seat uninvited on an empty crate, crossing his ankles, folding his hands, producing the posture of a man, settling in for a conversation that might take a while. What you actually want. I told the heroes what we want. You told them your demands. That's not the same thing. He watched her. Demands are the translation of wants into leverage. They're always a simplification. What do you actually want? The silence that followed was different from the perimeter silence, different from the corridor silence with Yayarozu. This was the silence of someone who had been carrying something so long that being asked about it directly was almost physically disorienting. My brother, she said finally. He's quirkless. He couldn't get into a support course. He couldn't get licensed. He works 3 jobs because he can't access the hero economy and he's just. She stopped, restarted. The system doesn't care about people it can't rank. Obi-Wan was quiet for a long moment. Somewhere outside, Shield Wall was almost certainly growing anxious. There were almost certainly cameras somewhere that Nizu had almost certainly arranged. He set all of that aside. No, he said. It doesn't. And that is a genuine wrong. He held her gaze. It is not, however, a wrong that this. He gestured gently at the bound employees. The warehouse, the situation in its entirety, will correct. The system will use today to justify itself. That is what systems do. They absorb attacks and call it proof of their necessity. Then what do we do? The question came out younger than her voice had been all morning. You go home, he said. You release these people, who have nothing to do with your brother's situation, and you go home. And then, he paused. I would like to meet your brother. She stared at him. I have found, Obi-Wan said, with the quiet certainty of a man who had seen institutions rise and fall across decades, that the most effective way to fight a flawed system is not to attack it from outside, but to become impossible to ignore within it. Your brother is not nothing because the system says so. The system is wrong. That is the system's problem, not his. He let that land. Will you let these people go home? At 7:43 in the morning, 11 pharmaceutical employees walked out of a warehouse in the Narahata district, unharmed. There were no cameras inside. There was no footage. There was no hero present. The report filed with the Hero Public Safety Commission listed the resolution method as negotiation unorthodox. Nizu read it, smiled his small precise smile, and said nothing at all. Aizawa came to him 3 days after the warehouse. He came at an hour that suggested he had been thinking about coming for considerably longer than 3 days and had finally run out of reasons not to. It was late enough that the school's corridors had settled into the specific quiet of an institution at rest, the particular silence of a building that is usually full of noise, remembering, briefly, what stillness feels like. Obi-Wan was in the small training annex that Nizu had quietly made available to him, working through the opening sequences of Sarisu alone in the dark, the blue blade painting slow geometric light across the walls. He heard Aizawa coming. He always heard Aizawa coming. Not because the man was loud. He was professionally silent. The footsteps of someone who had spent years moving through situations that punished noise. But because the force, even filtered and muffled as it was here, had gradually learned the particular signature of people Obi-Wan had been around long enough to recognize. It was like learning a face. The Force learned faces, in its way. He deactivated the lightsaber and sat down on the training mat. Aizawa stood in the doorway for a moment, then came in and sat against the opposite wall with the boneless exhaustion of a man who had already used up his daily allocation of effort and was operating on something beyond it. He produced, from somewhere in his capture weapon, a thermos and set it between them. "Tea," he said. "Thank you," Obi-Wan said. They sat for a moment in the comfortable silence of two people who had both independently concluded that silence was frequently underrated. "The warehouse," Aizawa said finally. The commission wants to debrief you. Again, formally. There are people there who are unhappy about the lack of footage. I imagine so. There are also people there who are happy about the outcome and are trying to figure out if they can take credit for it. I imagine that too." Aizawa poured tea into the thermos cap and passed it across. "Nizu thinks you should teach." Obi-Wan accepted the cup. The tea was strong and slightly bitter, and reminded him of nothing he had ever drunk before, which he found he appreciated. "Nizu thinks many things," he said. "He is usually several moves ahead of everyone in the room when he says them. He wants you to run a session with 1A, combat fundamentals, not quirk integrated, just—" Aizawa paused, choosing words with the care of someone who found most words slightly inadequate. "The way you fought in the 4th District. The principles underneath it." Obi-Wan was quiet. He looked at the lightsaber resting beside him. He thought about standing in front of young people who were being trained for a system that was using them as product and teaching them something the system hadn't asked for and might not want them to have. He thought about what Kagan would say, which was probably something elegant and infuriating about the living force and the present moment and trusting the path that presents itself. He thought about what he would say, which was considerably less elegant, and arrived at the same conclusion. "All right," he said. The session happened the following morning. He stood at the front of the training ground, not the gymnasium, the open ground, which he had requested specifically, because rooms with walls created the illusion of safety, and he wanted these students slightly uncomfortable, and looked at 20 young faces arranged in the neat rows of people who had been told to pay attention and were doing so with varying degrees of actual attention. "My name is Obi-Wan Kenobi," he said. "Most of you know this. What you don't know is what I'm going to ask of you today, so I'll be direct. I am going to ask you to make yourselves worse before you can become better. I am going to ask you to set aside everything your ability does naturally and examine what you do when it isn't there." Bakugo's expression conveyed precise and detailed skepticism. "You," Obi-Wan said pleasantly, in the front. "Would you come here, please?" Bakugo came forward with the aggressive confidence of someone who had never lost a physical confrontation and was comfortable with that record. He was compact and explosive in his movements, every gesture containing the compressed energy of something that preferred to move faster than it was currently moving. "Attack me," Obi-Wan said. Bakugo stared at him. "You're not using your—" He gestured at the lightsaber. "Thing? No. And I can use my quirk. Within reason. I'd prefer the training ground to still exist afterward." What followed was, by any objective metric, deeply instructive, though primarily for the audience rather than the participant. Bakugo was fast, powerful, tactically intelligent, in the specific way of someone who had won so many fights that victory felt like a baseline condition rather than an achievement. His explosions were precisely calibrated, his footwork aggressive and efficient. Obi-Wan moved around him like weather. Not quickly. That was the thing that visibly baffled the watching students. He could see it on their faces. The confusion of watching someone who wasn't faster than Bakugo, but was somehow consistently somewhere other than where Bakugo was targeting. Sarisu was not about speed. It was about geometry, about understanding that an attack has a destination, and that destination is not the defender's problem, as long as the defender is not in it. After 90 seconds, Bakugo was breathing hard. Obi-Wan was not. "Stop," Obi-Wan said. Bakugo stopped, with visible effort. "What did you notice?" "You never committed," Bakugo said. "The observation was immediate and accurate. Every time I found an angle, you were already off it." "Yes." "What?" A pause. This was the interesting pause. Bakugo processing not tactically, but philosophically, which was not a mode he defaulted to easily. "You knew where I was going before I got there." "I knew where you wanted to go," Obi-Wan said, "which is different. You telegraph your preference. It's a minor thing. But in a fight where someone is waiting for it, it becomes a liability." Bakugo finished. His jaw was tight. This was information he did not enjoy receiving, which meant it was exactly the information he needed. Obi-Wan moved through the class for the next 2 hours. He worked with each student individually, not demonstrating technique, but asking questions. What do you do when your quirk is unavailable? What do you do when the environment removes your primary advantage? What does your body know how to do when you stop thinking about what it knows how to do? Midoriya, predictably, had been taking notes throughout, even while participating, the notebook somehow appearing and disappearing from his hands with the practiced fluency of someone who had been doing this since childhood. Obi-Wan paused beside him during a partner exercise. "You understand the theory before you finished hearing it," Obi-Wan said quietly. "I've always been better at understanding things than doing them," Midoriya said, with the particular self-deprecation of someone who believed this more than the evidence supported. "That," Obi-Wan said, "is demonstrably untrue. I've watched you. Your problem is not understanding or execution. Your problem is that you are still somewhere underneath all of this." He gestured at the training ground, the session, the school on the hill, asking for permission to be capable. Midoriya went very still. "Stop asking," Obi-Wan said. "The answer is yes. It has always been yes." He moved on before the boy could respond, because some things needed space to settle in. And from across the training ground he felt, rather than saw, Toshinori Yagi standing at the edge of the facility watching everything with the stillness of a man for whom stillness had become a very particular kind of discipline. Their eyes met briefly across the distance. Obi-Wan gave a small nod. Yagi returned it. That evening, Obi-Wan was in his quarters when Aizawa knocked and entered with the specific expression of someone carrying information they would have preferred not to be carrying. "The League made a move," Aizawa said. "They've identified your location." "Not approximately." "Exactly." He held up the device. "Someone inside the commission leaked your room assignment." Obi-Wan looked at this information with the tired familiarity of a man who had spent 30 years discovering that institutions leak. "When?" he asked. "We think within the last 6 hours." "Then we have time," Obi-Wan said. "But probably not much of it." He looked at the window. The city lights of Mizudafu glittered with cheerful indifference to the complications of his situation. "I think," he said, "that it is time I stopped waiting for them to come to me." He did not tell the students. This was a deliberate choice, made with the full awareness that it was the kind of choice that could be criticized afterward. Paternalistic, some might say, or strategically short-sighted, or simply the habit of a man who had spent too many years deciding unilaterally what other people needed to be protected from. He had made that criticism of himself many times, in the quiet of desert evenings, working backward through decisions that had seemed right at the time and examining them in the unflattering light of consequence. But these were children. Whatever the hero course trained them to believe about themselves, whatever the rankings and the combat assessments and the public approval metrics encouraged them to feel about their readiness. They were 15 and 16 years old, and the League of Villains had already demonstrated, by Aizawa's account, a willingness to use them as leverage. Telling them would not make them safer. It would make them feel responsible for a situation they had not created. And in Obi-Wan's experience there was nothing more dangerous than a young person who had been handed adult guilt before they had finished developing the architecture to carry it. He told Aizawa. He told Nizu. He told After a moment's consideration, Toshinori Yagi, because something in the Force, quiet, tentative, but persistent, suggested that whatever was coming, Yagi should not be surprised by it. The meeting with Yagi happened in the small garden behind the faculty building, late enough that the school grounds were empty, early enough that the city's ambient light had not yet surrendered to full dark. Yagi was tall in the way of someone who had once been considerably taller. The height remained, but the mass that had filled it was gone, leaving a frame that moved with careful deliberateness, each motion measured against some internal calculation of what it could afford. They sat on a bench and were quiet for a moment, in the way of two people who had, somehow wordlessly agreed that whatever they were about to say deserved a proper beginning. "You know what I used to be," Yagi said. "It was not a question. I know what you carry," Obi-Wan said. "The specifics are yours." Yagi looked at his hands, large, scarred, folded together in his lap. "There's a boy in your morning sessions. Green hair. He's—" "Yes," Obi-Wan said. "You see it. Something was given to him. Something that was yours, perhaps." He kept his tone careful, not presumptuous. "I don't need to know the details, but I recognize the weight of an inherited power in someone who hasn't finished believing they deserve it." Yagi was quiet for a long moment. The garden smelled of something, flowering that Obi-Wan could not name, a smell that was entirely of this world and no other, sweet and slightly green, the smell of a planet that was alive, in ways his desert exile had nearly made him forget. "I made him my successor," Yagi said finally, "before I was certain he was ready, because I was running out of time and he was the only one I trusted." "I know something about that," Obi-Wan said. They looked at each other, and in the look, past the specific recognition of two people who have made the same category of choice under the same category of pressure and are still, years later, measuring the consequences. It was not comfortable. It was honest, which Obi-Wan had long ago decided was preferable to comfortable. "The League is moving against me," Obi-Wan said. "Tonight, possibly. Tomorrow at the latest." Yagi straightened. "I can." "No," Obi-Wan said, gently but without ambiguity. "You cannot. Whatever you used to be, you are not that now. And a fight built around your former capabilities is a fight designed to expose what you currently are." He held the taller man's gaze. "I need you here, with the students. If this goes wrong, it won't. If it goes wrong," Obi-Wan said again, with the patient firmness of a man who had learned through catastrophic personal experience that it won't go wrong was not a strategy. "I need someone here who understands what is at stake for them and will act accordingly." Yagi was silent. "Then, you're going to go to them. I am going to go to the vicinity of them," Obi-Wan said, "and see if we can have a conversation that doesn't require anyone to be hospitalized. I have found that approaching problems directly and honestly tends to produce better outcomes than waiting for them to arrive on your doorstep." He paused. "It also tends to produce worse ones, occasionally. But on balance, I prefer the forward approach." The location Aizawa had identified through channels that Obi-Wan did not ask too many questions about, because some intelligence networks were healthier left unexamined, was a disused arcade in the Kamino ward, a building that had been empty long enough to have developed the specific atmosphere of a space that has been empty and then deliberately made useful again. Obi-Wan arrived at 10:47 in the evening, alone, wearing his robe, lightsaber at his belt, with the expression of a man attending a meeting he had called himself. He sensed them before he entered, not through the Force. Alone, the interference here was still significant enough to make fine-grained sensing unreliable, but through the combination of Force, sensitivity, and 30 years of professional experience, reading the texture of occupied spaces, there were more than he had expected. Not 3 or 4, closer to 12. He went in anyway. The arcade was dim, smelling of old carpet and the particular staleness of a building that had been ventilated inadequately for some time. The machines along the walls were dark, their screens dead, their cheerful painted facades peeling at the edges into something sadder. In the center of the room, arranged with the loose theatrical staging of people who had thought carefully about how they wanted to be seen, was the League of Villains. Tamura Shigaraki was not what Obi-Wan had expected. He had expected older, somehow, The file Aizawa had shown him had conveyed age in the way that trauma conveys age. The sense of someone who had been living hard for a long time. But the figure in the center of the room was young in a way that was almost startling. Young and raw and vibrating with the specific energy of someone whose anger had been so thoroughly cultivated over so many years that it had become indistinguishable from personality. His hands, those dangerous hands, all 5 fingers always in play, always threatening, always the most important thing in the room, scratched at his neck with the absent compulsiveness of a bad habit, elevated to ritual. "You came alone," Shigaraki said. His voice was rough and oddly flat, like something that had learned to modulate through practice rather than intuition. "I usually do," Obi-Wan said. "That's either very confident or very stupid. People have been debating that about me for decades," Obi-Wan said pleasantly. "I've stopped trying to resolve the question." He looked around the room, mapping, always mapping. The positions of the 12, their relative readiness. The exits, the structural columns. The dead machines that could become cover. "I thought we might talk." Shigaraki stared at him. Something moved in his expression, surprise, maybe, or the echo of it, filtered through so many layers of performance that the original emotion was barely visible. "Everyone wants to fight us," he said. "Heroes show up with capture plans and backup teams and rescue protocols." He scratched at his neck again. "Nobody just walks in and says they want to talk. I find it tends to be more efficient," Obi-Wan said. He met Shigaraki's gaze directly, without challenge and without submission. The specific quality of attention. "That said, I see you without saying I am afraid of you or I am not afraid of you," both of which were provocations. "I know what you want to destroy. I'm less certain you know what you want to build." The silence that followed was fragile in the way of something that could go in several directions depending on the next 5 seconds. Then, from the shadows at the rear of the room, something moved. Not one of the 12. Something else. Something that had been there the whole time and had not registered even to Obi-Wan's filtered force sense until it chose to make itself known, which told him the concealment was not physical but something deeper, an ability that operated beneath the level of standard perception. A figure stepped into the dim light, and the force, muffled, interfered with, operating at a fraction of its usual clarity, went very, very cold. The figure was not large. That was the first thing. Obi-Wan had spent enough time around sources of significant power to know that power rarely announced itself through size. Yoda had been the most powerful being he had ever personally known and could comfortably fit in a shopping bag, but there was still something instinctively disorienting about the figure's scale. Medium height, slight build, dressed in a plain dark outfit that suggested either genuine indifference to appearance or the calculated performance of it. The face was obscured partially by shadow and partially by the specific quality of someone who had learned that anonymity was its own form of armor. What was not obscured was the sensation. It pressed against Obi-Wan's force sensitivity the way extreme cold presses against exposed skin, not painful exactly, but insistent, impossible to ignore. The body's immediate message that something here is wrong in a fundamental way. The force in this world was strange and filtered and argued with his midi-chlorians about jurisdiction, but it had never felt like this. This was not interference. This was intention. Whatever this person was, whatever ability they carried, it operated on a level that the force recognized and did not like. "Interesting," the figure said. The voice was calm and genderless, and carried the particular quality of someone who found the world consistently less surprising than other people found it. "You felt that?" "I did," Obi-Wan said. He kept his voice level. In his peripheral vision, he was tracking the 12 other League members, monitoring for any shift in posture that indicated they were about to move. None of them were. They were watching the new figure with the attentiveness of people who had been waiting for this moment. "Most don't," the figure said. "Even the sensitives. The ones whose quirks border on perception. They feel something wrong but can't locate it. You located it immediately." They stepped forward another pace. "What are you?" "A visitor," Obi-Wan said. "You?" "A facilitator," the figure said. For the moment, Shigaraki had gone very still in the specific way of someone who had been told to let someone else handle this part and was containing his impatience through sheer will. The dynamic between them was immediately legible. This was not all for one. Obi-Wan was fairly certain, but it was someone operating in that capacity, someone who had arrived to evaluate the situation and had the authority to redirect it. The League deferred to them. That was significant. You reached out to Jiren about me, Obi-Wan said, addressing the figure directly. You wanted my power profile and location. You have my location now. What did you want to know about the power? Whether it could be taken, the figure said simply. The Force went colder. Obi-Wan understood, with the particular clarity of a realization that arrives all at once rather than in stages. What he was looking at, not all for one himself, but something analogous, an ability that interfaced with other abilities at a fundamental level that could assess, copy, extract, or negate. The precise mechanics were unclear. The general shape was not. I see, he said. Do you? The figure tilted their head. Because what you have is unlike anything in this world. It doesn't read as a quirk, no quirk factor, no genetic marker, no physiological delivery mechanism. It operates on a completely different substrate, which means a pause that was not uncertainty but emphasis. It might not be subject to the same limitations, or it might not be transferable at all, Obi-Wan said. That's what I'm here to determine. Shigaraki scratched his neck. We don't need to determine anything, he said, with the impatience of someone who had been waiting for the conversation to become a fight. We just take it. You're welcome to try, Obi-Wan said, and there was no bravado in his voice when he said it, just the flat informational quality of a statement of fact, which was in some ways more unsettling than bravado would have been. He looked at Shigaraki directly. Before you do, I want to say something, and I want you to actually hear it, not perform hearing it. Shigaraki stared at him. You are right, Obi-Wan said, that the system is broken. You are right that it treats people as product. You are right that it protects its own legitimacy more fiercely than it protects the people it claims to serve. These are true things. I have seen versions of this truth in every political structure I have ever encountered, across a career that has lasted longer than you have been alive. He held the young man's gaze. You are wrong that destroying it will fix it. Destruction creates vacuums. Vacuums fill with whatever is strongest and least principled. I have watched this happen. I have watched a republic become an empire because the people who wanted to burn it down forgot to ask what would grow in the ash. The room was very quiet. The girl from the warehouse, Obi-Wan continued, whose brother couldn't access the hero economy. She didn't want to destroy anything. She wanted her brother to matter. Those are different goals. Yours is the second one dressed up as the first. He paused. I think someone taught you that. I think it was a long time ago, and it went very deep, and I think you have almost no idea that it happened. Something moved in Shigaraki's face. Underneath the effect, underneath the performance of ideology, something young and unformed and genuinely in pain surfaced briefly, like something breaking the surface of dark water and then submerged again. Then the figure moved, and the moment ended. They were fast, not quirk fast in the way of the speed-based heroes Obi-Wan had seen, but precise and economical, closing the distance between them with the efficiency of someone who had won many confrontations and attributed their success to removing hesitation from the equation. Their hand extended toward him with the clear intention of contact, of whatever assessment or extraction their ability required touch to perform. Obi-Wan's lightsaber was in his hand. Before the conscious decision to draw, it had fully formed. The blue blade cast hard shadows across the arcade. The figure stopped. Around the room, 12 League members shifted, and Obi-Wan felt rather then saw them begin to move and split his attention the way Sarisu required, not focus on one point but awareness distributed across the whole space. Every entry in the threat matrix given its appropriate weight. The next 40 seconds were the most demanding he had experienced since arriving in this world. The figure had an ability that disrupted concentration. He felt it pressing at the edges of his force connection each time they came near, attempting to interfere with the same subtle energy that his lightsaber drew from, that his precognition drew from, the static getting louder each time the distance closed. 2 of the 12 had physical enhancement quirks and moved in coordinated patterns that suggested they had trained together for precisely this kind of close-quarters engagement. A third could generate adhesive fields that twice caught the trailing edge of his robe and had to be force-pushed clear. He did not use the force unnecessarily. Each draw on it cost more here than it should, more than it would have in his own galaxy. And the figure's proximity made each draw cost more still. He managed his reserves, the way he would manage oxygen in a failing starship, not conserving, to the point of paralysis, but spending only what the moment strictly required. Sarisu held, not because he was unaffected, he was breathing harder than he had in the warehouse, harder than he had in the training ground with Bakugo, but because Sarisu had been designed for exactly this. For multiple threats, for sustained defense, for making a small amount of capacity last as long as it needed to. The form was not built on strength. It was built on endurance, on the understanding that a defense that could last long enough would outlast any offense. 6 of the 12 disengaged when it became clear that engagement was not producing results. 2 more when Obi-Wan redirected one's own momentum into another, with a force assist that he felt in his bones. The figure tried twice, more to close distance, and twice found the lightsaber between them and retreated. Then Shigaraki moved, not toward Obi-Wan, sideways, toward a communications panel on the far wall. And Obi-Wan understood a half-second too late that the fight had never been the point. The fight had been a distraction, a screen behind which Shigaraki had been transmitting something, sending something, and the target was not Obi-Wan at all. "UA," Shigaraki said, and smiled the smile of someone playing a longer game than the one you thought you were in. "We know where the first years sleep." The force, muffled and filtered and interfered with as it was, went very still. Obi-Wan made a choice. He lowered his lightsaber, not in surrender, in communication, in the specific language of a gesture that says, "I am changing what this is rather than I have lost." He looked at Shigaraki across the darkened arcade, past the remaining League members, past the figure who had gone still and watchful at the edge of his vision. "If you touch those students," he said, with a quietness that was more serious than shouting, "we are done talking forever. Everything I said tonight, every word about systems and vacuums and what you actually want gone. You become the thing you claim to oppose. You become someone who hurts children because it is the most effective leverage available." He paused. "Is that who you are?" Shigaraki's hand was on the panel. His expression was unreadable. "Because," Obi-Wan said, "I don't think it is. I think someone made you believe it is. And I think that is the worst thing they ever did to you." The hand didn't move. The room held its breath. Shigaraki's hand came away from the panel. It was not a dramatic gesture. There was no visible struggle, no moment of theatrical internal conflict playing across his features for an audience. His hand simply came away, slowly, scratching at his neck instead in the compulsive way it always did when something had reached him that he wasn't prepared to have reach him. He turned away from the communications panel and looked at the floor, and in that looking at the floor was something Obi-Wan recognized as one of the most difficult things a person formed by a lifetime of cultivated certainty can do: the brief, unguarded acknowledgement that a certainty might have a crack in it. The figure at the edge of the room watched this with an expression Obi-Wan could not fully read, not anger, not surprise, something more complicated than either, and then, without a word, stepped back into shadow and was gone. Not fled, gone, in the purposeful way of someone who had seen enough to make a calculation and had made it. Obi-Wan noted the exit and filed it under unresolved, which was a file that had been accumulating entries since he arrived in this world. The remaining League members looked at each other in the way of people awaiting instruction and receiving none. Obi-Wan deactivated his lightsaber. The blue light died and the arcade returned to its dim ambiguity. The dead machines patient in their silence along the walls. He could feel the force settling slightly, not back to its pre-fight state. The disruption the figure had caused lingering like the after impression of a bright light on closed eyes, but settling nonetheless. The way a disturbed pond eventually flattens itself back toward stillness. "I'm going to leave now," Obi-Wan said. He addressed this to Shigaraki, but said it at a volume that included everyone in the room. "I'm not going to report the specific location of this meeting to the Hero Public Safety Commission. I will report that contact was made, and that no students were harmed, and that the situation was resolved. That is all." He paused. "I would ask that you spend some time, genuinely, not strategically, not as preparation for the next move, considering what I said. Not because I expected to change everything immediately, because I think somewhere beneath everything you've been made into, there is a question you started with that deserves an honest answer. Shigaraki said nothing, but he didn't move, either, and in the specific grammar of someone who had learned to express themselves primarily through action. That stillness was its own kind of response. Obi-Wan walked out of the arcade into the Kamino night. The air was cool and smelled of salt. The bay was not far. He could hear the distant lap of water, and the city's ambient light made the sky, above a particular shade of orange that reminded him, for just a moment, of Tatooine's sunsets, which he had spent several years watching with the specific appreciation of a man who had run out of other things to do. He stood on the pavement outside the arcade and breathed, and let himself be tired, which was something he had learned late in life to permit himself. He contacted Aizawa. Briefly. Students safe. Situation contained. Explain later. He began walking back toward UA and, somewhere in the second block, the adrenaline that he had not acknowledged, having began to recede, and he walked through the Kamino streets in the particular clarity of a body that has been under significant stress and has decided, provisionally, that the stress is over. He thought about the figure, the one who had gone, the one whose ability had pressed against the force with that cold, extractive intentionality, who had come to assess whether his power could be taken, and had left without completing the assessment. That was not the end of that. He was experienced enough in how threats developed to know that a threat which steps back is not a threat which goes away. It is a threat that is reconsidering its approach. He thought about Shigaraki's hand on the panel, about how close it had been. He thought about the Jedi Order, which had spent a millennium being right, about so many things and catastrophically wrong about several crucial ones, and how the wrongness had not announced itself but had grown slowly in the space between principles and practice, in the gap between what they believed they were and what they were actually doing. He thought about children trained for war and called peacekeepers. He thought about a hero billboard that ranked people's value in units of public approval. He thought about a pharmaceutical warehouse and a young woman whose brother couldn't access an economy built around a genetic lottery. Different galaxies. The same questions. He arrived back at UA as the campus clocks showed 1:13 in the morning and found Toshinori Yagi sitting on the steps of the faculty building, awake and waiting, which was either touching or exasperating, and Obi-Wan chose to find it touching. They sat together on the steps, and Obi-Wan gave him the broad outline. Not every detail. Some details belonged to the arcade and the people in it, and Yagi listened with the focused attention of someone whose relationship with bad news had matured past the stage of reacting to it and arrived at the stage of simply receiving it. The students, Yagi said, were never in real danger, Obi-Wan said. Last night, at least. I'm not naive enough to claim that holds indefinitely. Yagi nodded slowly. You talked him down. I talked, Obi-Wan said. Whether he came down is his choice, not mine. I can put a door in a wall. I can't make someone walk through it. He looked at the dark campus grounds. The training fields empty and quiet. The building on the hill standing solid against the orange-lit sky. Your students, he said. They're extraordinary. I want you to know that I mean that precisely and not generically. Yagi's expression shifted into something warm and complicated. I know. Midoriya especially. But not only him. Obi-Wan paused. Whatever the ranking system tells them, whatever the billboard reduces them to, Yaoyorozu's intelligence, Todoroki's precision, even Bakugo's. He considered everything Bakugo is doing underneath the performance of what Bakugo is doing. These are not products. They are people in the process of becoming something. And that process deserves better architecture than they've been given. Yagi looked at him for a long moment. You sound like someone who lost students. The words landed quietly, the way true things do when they don't need volume to carry. I sound like someone who is trying, Obi-Wan said carefully, not to repeat the mistakes that cost me them. They sat in silence for a while after that, two men from different contexts, from different histories, carrying different versions of the same general weight, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who have decided that they don't need to explain themselves to each other, because the explanation is already visible. Is there a way home? Yagi asked finally. Nizu's researchers think so, Obi-Wan said. Something to do with the same Force anomaly that brought me here. They're working on replicating the conditions. He looked at the orange sky. It may take time. And while you're here, Obi-Wan considered the question, the training ground, the warehouse, the arcade, the face of a young man whose hand had come away from a panel because something had reached him that he hadn't expected, and felt the Force, filtered and strange and arguing with his midi-chlorians about jurisdiction, settle fractionally warmer. I'll teach, he said, and I'll talk to people, and I'll try, as I have always tried, to leave things slightly better than I found them. A pause, with variable success, historically, but the attempt seems worth making. Yagi made a sound that was, Obi-Wan suspected, the closest thing he had to a laugh that he still allowed himself in this diminished form. Variable success, he repeated. Yes, I know something about that. I thought you might, Obi-Wan said. Above them, the UA campus was quiet. In the dormitories, 20 young people with extraordinary abilities and ordinary fears were sleeping, becoming, in the gradual way of people who don't know yet what they're becoming. In an arcade in Kamino, a young man with dangerous hands was sitting, in the dark with a crack in a certainty he had carried since childhood. In the shadows of the city, a figure with cold, extractive intent was reconsidering its approach. And on the steps of a faculty building in a world far from his own, a tired Jedi Master watched the orange sky and felt, faintly but distinctly, something that was not quite the Force and was not quite not the Force, threading through this strange and crowded and heartbreaking and hopeful galaxy, with the same stubborn persistence it had always shown. He closed his eyes. He breathed. He waited to see what the morning would bring. Obi-Wan Kenobi came to a world that ranked its heroes and numbered its students and built its hope on visibility. And he brought with him the oldest lesson the Jedi had ever failed to fully practice. That power without wisdom is just destruction waiting for a direction. He did not save UA Academy in a single blazing battle. He did not defeat the League of Villains or dismantle the Billboard rankings or fix the broken economy that left quirkless people behind. He did not do any of the things that would have made a satisfying highlight reel. He listened. He taught. He walked into a dark arcade alone and told a broken young man a truth that no one had thought to tell him before. Whether Shigaraki's hand staying off that panel means something lasting, only time will say. Whether the figure with cold intentions returns better prepared, Obi-Wan has no illusions. Whether Midoriya grows into the weight he carries. Whether Yaoyorozu stops asking permission to be brilliant. Whether Todoroki thaws the frozen half of himself. These are not things a visitor can determine. They are things that belong to the people living them. But the door is in the wall now, and somewhere in a world that had never heard of the Force, something very like it was paying attention.